Welcome to Killer Women with your host, best-selling author Danielle Girard. And now, Danielle's next killer woman.
Welcome to Killer Women Podcast, a proud member of the Authors on the Air global network with more than 4 million listeners. I am your host, suspense author Danielle Girard, and my guest today is Mary Kubica. Mary is a New York Times best-selling author of thrillers including The Good Girl, Local Woman Missing, and She's Not Sorry. Her books have been translated into over 30 languages and have sold over 5 million copies worldwide. She's been described as a helluva storyteller, Kirkus Reviews, and a writer of vice-like control by the Chicago Tribune. And her novels have been praised as hypnotic by People and thrilling and illuminating by the LA Times. She lives outside Chicago with her husband and children. Welcome, Mary.
Thanks, Danielle. I'm so excited to be here.
I know. Welcome back, I should say.
Yeah.
It's not your first time on the show. We got to read It's Not Her for today's show. So, before we dig into all the fun things about this, can you tell our listeners about your new book?
Yeah, so It's Not Her is the story of two Chicago families that go vacationing together in the Northwoods of Wisconsin, and they rent two cottages in a little remote lakeside community. And overnight, two of the family members in one of the cottages get killed, and they're discovered the next morning by a woman named Courtney. She's one of our main protagonists. And not only are these two people killed, but Courtney's teenage niece is missing, and she doesn't know, if she's another victim or if potentially she has done this. So the story is told from the points of view of Courtney in the present as she tries to, protect the rest of her family and figure out who killed her brother and sister-in-law. But it's also told from 17-year-old Reese's perspective in the days leading up to the murder and her disappearance, where we find out that Reese would rather be anywhere than on vacation with her family.
So, Mary, you have teenagers. Do your teenagers or your kids a little older now?
I have an 18-year-old and a 20-year-old. So one
Okay.
teenager, one not.
Okay. I was gonna say, because like when I read Reese's perspective, I was like, yep, this just rings 100% true for what it's like to be a teenager, with your family and also to what it's like to be a mom, right? Like, or in Courtney's case, the aunt, like trying to navigate this. So I'm always curious to know, how much of your incredible twisty plots, which right down to the very last page, literally, you're like, oh wow, I did not see that coming. How do you do that? How do you spin your magic?
Yeah, so I mean, for the characters, I do, I rely on the people around me. I pay attention to just different behaviors and conversations. And, of course, when we released the book, but, you and I, we know that we were probably working on it like a year or 2 years ago, well before the release date. So my 20-year-old probably was Reese's age. She's my daughter, at the time. So there is a lot of her that I see in Reese. It doesn't mean that, Reese is her,
No, no,
but
no. Or that she is Reese, right? They've got,
right. You
we're
just sort of
grateful
pick up
for.
on like those teenage tendencies and the way they talk and some of their inner dialogue too. And I was a teenage girl once long ago,
Yeah.
so I do remember how difficult it is to be a teenage girl. I can't even imagine what it would be like to be a teenager now
No,
in like the
social
age of social
media.
media.
Yeah.
So I draw on all of that. I really try to make my books like equally suspenseful and page turning and all of that as they are character driven because I feel like that's just so necessary for the reading experience. It doesn't mean that the reader is going to agree with everything that a character says or does, but just that they feel like they understand why a character is making the decisions that they are, and that there's a good reason for them sometimes, or just a reason, maybe not a good reason, but a reason. I'm not a plotter, so I just kind of like I get an idea and I dive in and sort of see where my characters lead me.
Okay, so I love that. So because I'm not a plotter either, and I always feel like sometimes that the idea that these sort of twists, and we're not going obviously we don't there's no spoilers, but I'm curious to know so do you feel like the first draft is the way you learn the characters, and then some of the strong stronger more sort of amazing twists happen later, or do those happen in the beginning? I mean, I'm curious to know sort of because I think there's a sense, right, that like an author writes a book and then it's more or less done. And I think in reality, right, sometimes the whole first draft is just about figuring out sort of who the people are and what potential twists and red herrings and then the second draft is where you sort of nail down the real sort of hardcore fabulous twists. How does it does that how it happens for you? How does it happen for you? And has it changed? Does it change book to book?
Yeah, that's pretty much spot on how it happens for me, because I don't often know where my story is going. I don't know, who my villain is going to be. I don't know what the twists are going to be. So it's just like a learning experience, that first draft. And I do throughout the process start to figure things out. But a lot of times, like red herrings are introduced because I don't know yet. Like, is
Yes,
this my villain or not?
right.
I need to get to know them and just really like understand just the whole environment and all the different moving pieces to figure out what makes the most sense. So yeah, like a lot of times that first draft is just really getting to know the character and the setting and just all of that and figure out, people's backstories, like why are they at this point in time? Why are they coming together and things like that. And like I said, I do start to figure out my twists and my villain and things like that during the process. But then I go back, and I start to really put those breadcrumbs in once I figure out like where the story is going. And that's really one of my favorite parts of the process is when there is like that aha moment and I do know what my twist is going to be and things start to make sense and I can see that picture so much more clearly and I can go back and sort of lay those clues for readers to follow.
And that's sort of that's not the first draft necessarily. That's
No, it's not, and sometimes something might inadvertently get, put in there and it isn't until later that I'm like, aha, that works. And that's such a fun experience.
yeah, it feels a little bit like magic. I noticed in your acknowledgments you sort of thank the people that you said some key people that you get to sort of brainstorm with. So how much of the process of sort of like uncovering this is just sitting at the computer, which I know obviously is a ton of it, and how much of it is being like, I sort of have this thing happening and talking it through with somebody.
Yeah, more of it is really just me sitting there and dwelling on it and things like that. And I noticed, I mean, like my big thing for, sort of tips for writers is when I'm stuck, I just walk away from it. I feel like my mind is always spinning. And it seems to me that, when I'm at the grocery store or doing laundry or whatever, those are the times when I usually work through the most difficult plot issues, not when I'm staring at my computer getting frustrated. So I like to write my first draft kind of to myself, by myself. I think that it's Stephen King says something about, write with the door closed, revise with the door open, something to that
Yeah.
effect. And I'm sort of like that. I really like to figure things out for the first time by myself. And then I let people in because that feedback is just so vital. I share right away a draft with my editor and my agent, my husband, and I have a group of friends that I'll always share a draft with to get feedback. And that feedback, it's subjective. Everybody's not always going to feel the same way about it, but it's just so valuable at that point in the process to get as much feedback as I can and just know, I think as writers, we're sometimes too close to our own work. And so it's hard to see like, is the twist obvious? Is this character totally one-dimensional? Things like that, because they might feel very real to us, but on paper, they may strike a reader in a different way. So I love getting that feedback and then I can go back to it. It's also just a great experience too, because when I give that draft to somebody else, I'm away from it.
Yeah.
And you get that break that is so necessary, and then you can go back to it with totally fresh eyes.
And do you feel like you write a first draft pretty, I mean, because I think that something about being in the book, people ask, do you write every day? And how, I mean, there is something about like when you're in it, if you sort of get the distance too soon, then you sort of lose the thread or the characters start to sort of feel like, a little bit more distant to you. So when you're in that first draft, are you writing it kind of quickly and intensely, or also you're raising kids, or you have been raising kids too, so then it gets kind of hard. How does that work for you?
Yeah, I just try to write like a little bit every day. And, so it doesn't mean that I'm going to have like 5 hours or 8 hours to write on a given day. It might be an hour, it might be
Yeah.
30 minutes. But as long as I can just stay present in that manuscript, it makes it so much easier to go back to it. And that's not to say that like the holidays are coming up and things are going to be crazy and my daughter will be home from college. And, sometimes life gets in the way and I might not be able to open that manuscript for a week or whatever. But the more that I can just stay somehow in it, then I don't feel like I have to relearn those characters. Because if
Right.
I do take an extended time away from it, I've got to go back and I need to read it and I need to get totally like reacclimated in the story and those characters' lives.
When you start a book, like, what sort of, what do you go in with? Like, do you have an idea of like, is there a scene? Is there just like the setup of the characters? Like, for instance, if we talk about, it's not her, and we got, you said, you've got these, a sister and her brother and their respective families. How much of that did you sort of say, I know two people die and a girl goes missing, or what, sort of how did you, or did that change? I'm always curious.
Yeah, I knew that. I knew that two people were going to die. Or I think I knew, I'm trying to remember now. I think I knew for sure one person was going to die. Um, I knew that we were going to have the missing girl. And this comes out pretty quickly, but there's another teenage boy who's in the home and he conveniently sleeps through the whole thing, and I loved this opening, which it was inspired by a true crime story, the Ketty Cabin Murders, which happened back in the 1980s in Ketty, California. And just sort of that opening scene inspired It's Not Her. From there, it goes off in a totally different direction. Ketty Cabin Murders are still unsolved, but just sort of that setup, and I was intrigued by this idea of from that opening scene, I have suspects, and as a
Right.
writer, a mystery writer, like I wanted to solve that. And that's usually where I start my books is this mystery that needs solving, and as long as I can sort of envision this opening setup and the potential for suspects, then I'm off to just solve it. And that's really what I do. I sort of like as a writer, I dive into it and, I don't know who did this. So I just sort of start to solve it along with my characters.
And now there's also in the book there's a previous girl who'd gone missing, some time ago. And was that part of your original story idea as well?
No, no, not
Yes.
at all.
Yeah.
So, that didn't exist until like the day I wrote it, which is
Yeah.
always it's just a cool part of the process, because like I said, I literally didn't dream that up until I think I wrote that scene where her story is created. And so I love like literally getting up in the morning and not knowing for sure what's going to happen in the lives of my characters.
Yeah, no, I see, and one see how that was, how that showed up, and also obviously how it really increases the stakes on a whole bunch of different levels. So it's fabulously done. So, sometimes I've heard people say like, when they finish a day that they don't finish at the end of a chapter, or they don't finish because it gives them sort of a way to get in the next day. And I think one of the hardest things we face as writers is that like blank screen, right? That's sort of like the beginning of chapter 17 or whatever it is, and you're like, oh God, what now? Do you have, all these books later, do you have tricks for that?
Yeah, it's funny because somebody at some point in my career kind of gave that as advice. And to not like tie everything up in a nice bow at the end of a day because you go back the next page to a blank screen, and a new
Yes.
chapter, and that is daunting. Um so I do, I sort of I try to end like mid-chapter, mid-scene, like and it seems so counterintuitive, to like stop when the words are actually flowing, but it makes for coming back the next day just it makes it so much easier. You can just kind of get back into that excitement in that process. If I do happen to like tie things up at the end of a day, then I'll usually start my day by editing what I wrote the previous day to really kind of like get back into that momentum and feel good about what I wrote. And then hopefully it kind of carries me into a new chapter.
Right. No, I think that's right. And also sometimes you can kind of like finish a chapter and be like, well, here's some things that might happen next. Because I also think there's some like, and you talked about this when you talked about walking away and doing laundry, or, you're a runner. Is that a place, where ideas come?
Yeah, that is like my best plotting time. I mean, I think it's just because I'm alone for a long time with my thoughts, and I listen to music when I run. I've tried, but I can't do like audiobooks, books or podcasts. I love them any other time. But when I run, I think I'm just exhausted
Yeah.
and can't focus and things like that. But there's something about, I don't know if it's like the physical exhaustion that like lets my mind just like go when I'm running or just the solitude, but there's something about it that's really when I do my best plotting.
Yeah, it makes us all want to be long distance runners, Mary. But I literally, that is not going to work for me. Well, I think all of these things are always, so helpful to hear everybody just different processes. Now, the other question I had is, has it sort of emerged, changed over the course of your career? And, are there things that you used to do that like, you're like, I would never do that again? versus things you didn't know back then that you now realize?
For the most part, my process has stayed the same. I one of the quirky things that I do is when I write a book with multiple narrators, which almost all of my books have, is I write one of the narrators at a time, and then once that's done, I switch gears and I write the other. So with It's Not Her, I wrote all of Courtney's story first, and then when it was done, I switched gears and I wrote Reese's perspective. And so that was something that I started with my first book, The Good Girl, totally out of necessity. There was a couple different narrators and like two different timelines, and I was losing track of things.
Hmm.
So I thought, okay, I'm just going to sit down and I'm going to write this, and then I'll switch gears so I can focus and I can make that narrator's voice totally unique, so they don't just all end up sounding the same. And I found that I loved it, and I could figure out, start to kind of figure out other plot lines while I was like, or other narratives while I was writing one. But yet I just was able to stay so much more in the story when I wasn't bouncing back and forth between narrators. So that was one of the things that I've kept throughout all of my books. I think that like one of the big things, and I'm struggling a little bit to come up with an example, but before I published The Good Girl, my first book, I was super reluctant to share anything with anybody. I was like, nobody knew that I wrote. I was one of those types of authors that just really kept to myself. And so with The Good Girl, it was the first time that I was sharing anything with, an editor and an agent and getting that feedback. So I think that I was able to learn a lot about my own strengths and weaknesses as a writer. And just getting that feedback, I feel like now I can go into each manuscript knowing these are the things that are important. These are maybe the things that I have a tendency to do. Like I know in some early drafts that I turn in, I tend to use like certain phrases so many times, and my editor is like always calling me out on this. Like you said the words like time and again 400 times.
Oh yeah, I'm doors. For me, it's doors. There's everybody's always walking in and out of doors, standing in doors. Yeah, I think somebody counted there was like 300 doors in one book. So yeah, it's a
Right.
problem.
So now it's like I just go in and I pay attention, like, okay, you're saying that too much.
Yeah, yeah, that's so funny. So, what do you do when when the feedback is different? So, like, I know, you get. I mean, obviously, there's a hierarchy, right? Editor and agent, I would imagine at the top. But what happens? Have you had a situation where people come at something and react to it differently enough that you're sort of have to figure out sort of what's the right answer?
Yeah, there have been situations like that. Now, for the most part, I will say it's a little more obvious. Thank goodness. It makes it easier for me to kind of sort it out. But there are times where there's conflicting opinions. And I do agree with you, like the editor and agent are always going to come first. But sometimes it's also just like a gut feeling. And I'm sure you can relate to this, just like knowing what is right for your manuscript. And I think the other thing too is even though my books are suspense and like terrible things are happening to people, I want them to be very plausible too. So when it comes down to like a plot thing, a lot of times for me, just like the simplest solution is the right one because it seems to make it just more possible that this could really happen.
Right.
So those are just a couple things that I kind of try to keep in mind when I'm sorting out that feedback.
I'm so curious about this idea that you write one character at a time because all my books are also multiple point of view, and it's sort of hard to imagine. Is it then hard? Are you then taking like Courtney's, you've got Courtney's whole story. Are you then sort of like able to sort of like take Reese and sort of work her against whatever was happening with Courtney? Because there's this sort of back and forth that works really well between the two of them, and I would imagine if you wrote one in a vacuum and then the other in a vacuum, it'd be really hard to fit them together. So
Yeah.
how does that work?
There's definitely some revision that needs to happen because sometimes, once I put it back together, it's like, oh, we've, discovered something in Reese's perspective while Courtney's still like,
Yeah.
figuring things out. And then it takes the suspense away from Courtney's chapter because we already know what happens. For
Right.
example, so that I have to be careful of for sure. So it requires, some edits like, okay, well, whatever we discovered here maybe needs to move up or whatever to make
Right.
sure that we keep the suspense going in all parts of the story. It was easier in this book than some others because the timelines don't match up perfectly. Like Reese's perspective is a few days before. So things aren't quite as back and forth as they might be in a different novel of mine. So that really helped it to flow a little bit easier.
And also, what Courtney knows in the present is not going to be at all what Reese knows in the past, right? So it's
Right.
not like Reese is going to discover something in the present because she's not in the present. So that I can see how that makes it. So when you are writing Reese, are you looking at what happened? Like, oh, this is what happened with Courtney. Now
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So in Courtney's perspective, something was introduced, but now in Reese's perspective, I've got to answer it, So it's sort of like that. I've got to give a reason for why that happens. And
Mhm.
so it's great, and usually that first perspective ends up being the more difficult because that's where I'm sort of like introducing all the suspense and in the back of my mind knowing, okay, somehow I've got to close this loop, in the other one. And but just really the creation, the bigger part of the creation, I feel like happens in that first narrative, and then the second one just sort of ties into it.
So this was based on, or at least it was sort of inspired loosely on a true crime. Is that oftentimes where your ideas come from?
No, I mean, I listen to true crime podcasts all the time. I watch all the documentaries. I'm like, as probably most mystery suspense authors, I'm a little obsessed with it. But this was the first one that I was listening to that, right away, like I said, I was intrigued by this opening setup and this idea of it was the suspects more than anything, I think. I just got chills kind of listening to this podcast. And and in the real story, it really isn't sort of presented that way. But like my mystery thriller writer mind went there, that
Yeah.
all these people could be suspects, and in reality, in the true Keddy cabin murders, the children that are in the home that sleep through the murders are very young.
Yeah.
It's obvious they didn't do this, and even the missing daughter in the real story, she's young too. And so they're not really presented as suspects,
Right.
but just more like what happens, so it inspired me, but then of course, like my writer mind takes it to another level.
Because once you've had teenagers, you can imagine them as killers, really.
For sure. All of them.
And it is interesting. I mean, that is what I like about it too, is the idea that there's the warring parts of you that are like, there's no way your kid, or your niece or nephew or anybody could be guilty of this. And also the idea that, well, but really, like, and I think what's lovely about Courtney is that she's this, loving aunt and wife, but she also, like, you do all the doubts. It's not just, right? It's not just the kids, it's her husband, it's her, her brother, who is, like, everybody starts to look a little bit, and I imagine that's the case, right? Also at the ticking time bomb of the missing daughter, right? Not everybody's dead. We have this sort of lie. That's another thing you always do really well is you have this isn't just solving a crime. We're also trying to, find and save somebody.
Right, right. And I love, just sort of like adding that dimension to my stories because I feel like, I feel like it hopefully makes for a richer reading experience for the reader, but also I want there to be more than one mystery because as these books, everything kind of depends on that big twist and if the reader is surprised by the big twist. So I try to make it, just there to be more than one big twist, or maybe there's one big twist, but there's smaller twists so that the reader will have a really good, hopefully, experience. Even if they solve one thing, there are still other things that will hopefully surprise them.
Yeah, and it's hard, right? I mean, these readers are so savvy. I think thriller readers are the, like, sharpest, hardest people to trick.
It's so true. And then, I mean, I feel like the genre too has exploded over the last decade, and so there's so many incredible authors out there doing amazing things, and so it's like you're constantly having to think about what has been done and how can you bring something different to it.
Yeah, which I think that's high pressure. So it's good that, we have to figure out a way to stay out of our own way too, which I appreciate the hearing, the not plotting. I also think, like, I don't know if you've ever tried to plot. I tried to plot a book once, and by the time I had sort of plotted it through, I thought, oh, I don't really even care anymore, right? Because for me,
Bored,
the
right?
magic is in discovering.
Right. I'm the exact same because there are those days that I like write myself totally, into a hole and I delete chapters and I think, man, if I would just plot this out, I wouldn't be in this position.
Yeah.
Well, you're right. Like it loses the magic for me. And that's not for all authors. There's a lot of authors out there that do like 30-page, outlines before they begin, and that works for them. But for me, I really like to be surprised. I like to just see it happen, as I'm writing.
Yeah, it does feel like, it absolutely feels like the magic. But well, this was so fun, Mary. And we will be giving away a copy of It's Not Her on the Danielle's Killer Women Facebook group, or we are now on Instagram as well at Killer Women Podcast. And Mary, we were talking before we started recording, Mary is also doing a really big tour. It sounds like she's going to be all over hell and back in the best possible way. So, Mary, tell us where to find out where you're going to be.
Yeah, if you go to my website, which is Mary Kubica, Kubica.com, just go under, I think it's news and events, and I have listed there all of my events. So the tour starts on February 2nd, and I will be pretty much everywhere. I think I'm hitting like 11 states. So maybe not everywhere, but in a lot of places. And I hope to see some of you on the road.
That's so exciting. Thank you so much for joining us again today, Mary. It was so fun to have you back.
Thank you for having me.
Everyone, this was Killer Women with Mary Kubica, and we will see you next time. Bye.